Next up, let's see how we can write code inside of component did mount that will go and fetch or make a request to get some data that we'll then use to update the state. So how do we load data from somewhere else? So the data I'm going to start with is super simple for this basic example. There's an API, api.github.com/zen, and it just gives you a random like Zen developer quote. Anyway, it's not that exciting, but it's simple enough. I'll have a second example after this, but it honestly doesn't matter because we're focusing on the workflow. So we need something to make the request for us, and I'm going to use a library rather than doing it from scratch. The library I like is called Axios. So we need to install it. So I stop the server, npm install Axios, and then once that finishes, start the server back up. Okay, so now I have my basic component structure. It's going to be called Zen quote. And I'm going to use Axios in here. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios. Again, we don't need // because it's a node module in this directory. Okay, so we're going to start by adding our component did mount. And inside of here, we're going to load data and then set state with that data. So what are we going to store this data under that comes back? This little piece of text, let's call it quote. So in our render, let's do an h1 that says, always remember, and then maybe a paragraph tag that has this .state.quote, which doesn't exist right now. So to load the data, we can do axios.get, and then we pass in the URL, and then .then, and let's call it res or response, the data that comes, or the object that comes back, and then we can start by just console.logging response. And I'm actually going to get rid of this. Right now our render will just be a paragraph or an h1. So let's see what's coming back. I need to make sure that I am importing my Zen quote, and then I'll render one here. Okay, so if we open up the console, we see we get an object back, and we want the request.data or response.data. That's what we want to set the state with. So let's do that now. Back in Zen quote, we want response.data. That's the actual quote, and we can just call this .set state, and let's call it quote, and set the state with that, and then come back down here and display this .state.quote. Now there is a problem here with what we have set up. Can you see it? Are you able to figure out what we'll see? We have an error. It's saying cannot read property quote of null. So there is no state. It can't find quote because it can't find state. We haven't set our initial state. We're setting state, but we haven't actually initialized our state. And the reason this matters is that when this actually runs, remember we get one render at the beginning before component did mount is called. So this call is called after render. So we render at the beginning. It's looking for this .state.quote. It doesn't exist. And then afterwards, if it were to keep going, which it doesn't because the code stops execution, but if it did, then we would be setting quote. So this is a common issue that I've seen in other students. We need to make sure we have our constructor where whatever we are setting state inside of a callback, inside of component did mount, AJAX, Axios, wherever the data is coming from, if we're setting it to be something like quote, we need to have this .state equals, and we need to initialize quote to something. Okay, so you'll see for a moment when I refresh, it's not there, and then it loads. I know it's kind of hard to see. There we go. If I refresh over and over and over, there, you can see it's happening. So that's the basics of the basic workflow, the structure for loading data in component did mount. We set our initial state in the constructor. This runs first. It says, all right, there's this thing called state, and there's one property called quote. It's an empty string. Then render is called, and it goes to the state. Right now it's empty, or quote is empty, so it displays nothing in this paragraph. Then component did mount is called because the component just mounted. So then we go and fetch our data, and when it's done, we set state, which is going to cause another render, and this time quote has a value. So you might be thinking, why not just do this in the constructor? Why not just do something like this? Let's just comment this whole thing out. And in the constructor, we set our state, or our initial state, then we do our axios.get, and we set state to be quote with the response data. And if I go to my browser and refresh, it seems like that works fine. And that's because it actually does work fine. But that doesn't mean you should do it. This is one of those things that basically the React docs say you shouldn't do. It's convention not to set state inside of your constructor. And the docs always recommend that anytime you're fetching data, you do it inside of component did mount. There are some sort of convoluted and complicated reasons behind that. If you read some of the GitHub issues, I have one open here where somebody made an issue saying, explain why component did mount is a better place to make an AJAX request. And there's a long thread between some of the React developers and some React users who are sort of debating it. And the gist of the answer, if you care, is that eventually there will be features in React, future behavior that doesn't exist now, where loading data in the constructor could be problematic. So they're sort of preparing for that. But beyond the exact reasoning why, all that you should really take away is that if you want to load data, almost always you're doing it in component did mount. Also remember, setting state in the constructor is a no-no. Even if it doesn't break things, even if it works exactly the way you want it to, it's not a good idea. You're breaking the rules of the React community. You're making people very sad. So it's not a very satisfying answer, I know, but let's chalk it up to convention. It's what everyone else does. It's what the doc says to do. We're not going to load data inside the constructor. We're going to do it in component did mount. And that's all I want to show in this video. We are loading data with Axios. There are many other libraries and tools you can use. You don't even have to use an external tool, but this makes it nice and easy. And we have our initial value for state. That's very important. That will trip you up if you don't have state assigned at the beginning, because render is called before component did mount. And then if we set state in here, it causes a re-render, and then we see the new quote that we just loaded. All right, next I'm going to show you how to do a very simple loading icon, a little animated thing, and how that would work. And then we'll move on to another example where we make a slightly more complicated request. And then we're going to talk about updating and the rest of the lifecycle.